Okay, aronia was astringent. Sea buckthorn is sour. It does have a really great flavor that's sort of citrusy or pineapple-y or mango-y, depending on the cultivars. There's many cultivars, and some of them can taste pretty good, and some of them really don't taste good because they were developed for their oil content.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story. I'm your host, Emma Biggs.
And I'm Stephen Biggs. We talk to creative food gardeners and farm and garden experts who break the rules and make new ones too. Last week, we were in Quebec chatting with Laurie Brown, who's an agronomist with the Cultur'Innov co-op. Her passion is specialty fruit crops, minor crops, and helping people grow and commercialize them. Last week, we heard about aronia and how it doesn't taste too good. She also told us about elderberry and haskap, and today, she's going to continue with more crops that really fly under the radar. And Laurie describes one of them as the blue cheese of fruit. Any guesses what it is? You might be surprised. Stay tuned to find out. If you're a grower considering crop opportunities, this episode's for you. But if you're a home gardener, this is for you too. These are plants I've seen woven into edible landscapes and used in food forests. You can find Cultur'Innov online at cultur'innov.qc.ca. That's cultur'innov.qc.ca. Now, here's our chat with Laurie Brown. Another one of the crops that you're involved with is one that I've seen to some extent here in Ontario, which is the sea buckthorn. And
yes.
Where's that at? Tell us about that.
I would like to know what it's at in Ontario. Yeah. Sea buckthorn, I guess, was the first emerging berry crop in Quebec, the first one to be up and running. It's such an interesting crop. It's in the family, sort of a cousin of the olive tree. It's a plant that fixes some of its nitrogen through a symbiotic relationship with a root bacteria, and it grows very quickly. This is another plant that likes a bit of a heavier soil or frequent water, which is kind of contrary to the public perception of the plant, because you'll often see pictures of it growing on top of a mountain in Tibet or Italy or something, and it looks like it's growing between two rocks, but actually it does need a regular water supply. And this is a berry. Okay, aronia was astringent. Sea buckthorn is sour. It does have a really great flavor that's sort of citrusy or pineapple-y or mango-y, depending on the cultivars. There's many cultivars, and some of them can taste pretty good, and some of them really don't taste good because they were developed for their oil content. So, for a home grower, you wouldn't want to grow them.
So cultivar choice really is important, depending on the end use then.
In sea buckthorn, yes, especially there's male and female cultivars, and you better have one plant of each or you're not going to get anything. And then there's, they can ripen, I guess in Ontario, you could probably be picking the early ones at the end of July and the late ones in the middle of September. So there's a really wide range of harvest dates too. So there's a lot of choice there, and you can have cultivars that come from Russia or from Germany or from Estonia or from Canada. There were some developed on the prairies. They have thorns. I wouldn't say it's not thorny like a thorny raspberry bush or a thorny gooseberry bush, not to that extent, but you will get poked with them. The funny thing about sea buckthorn is the berries are hard to pick. They don't want to come loose from the plant, and then you pull a little bit harder and you end up squishing them. You can pick them by hand, and there is U-pick in sea buckthorn plantations in Quebec. But for commercial growers, what they actually do is just cut off the whole branch, because the branches can be loaded with berries. There's nothing more beautiful than you should find a picture of a branch of sea buckthorns loaded with berries and put it on your site. It's just really impressive. And so they might cut off a branch and there might be, I don't know, a pound and a half of fruit on that branch. And they just cut off the branch, put the branch in the freezer, the whole branch, and freeze it right down to at least -20, -22. And then it's like a miracle that you could not get those berries off the branch before. And at -22, you shake the branch and they come off quite easily. So that adds a whole step to the process of being a sea buckthorn grower. You have to have freezer capacity, and you have to have some kind of equipment to sort of shake the berries off the branches and then clean them while keeping them frozen. There's not really anything, there's no fresh sea buckthorn market. They're always pretty much frozen, except for the little bit of U-pick I was talking about that attracts a lot of people from Eastern Europe who know about them.
Okay, so there's a bit of U-pick mostly in the processing, and then there's this step of freezing as part of the processing.
Yeah, sea buckthorn growers end up spending a lot of time in their freezer doing things, and it's not, they get a little fed up, it's cold in there. And sea buckthorn is, I'd say, it's mostly sold as a health juice or as something that would be used to make a health drink. For smoothies, it's really nice, mixed in with other things. If you take it straight, it's you can, but it's a little sour. But because it has a high oil content, you get an interesting little froth on the top, sort of like the cream on top of milk.
Oh.
So it's interesting thing to drink. So you can certainly make juice products. You could make juice blends. And you can also make a lot of cosmetics with it, because it's one of the very rare plants that contains omega-7s in its oil. And omega-7s are for cellular regeneration. So they're used in beauty products for the skin and products for people who suffer burns, and hair regeneration, for people who are going bald. And and the cosmetic industry is not regulated as much as the pharmaceutical industry. So
okay, so that's a possible doorway then for entrepreneurial producers.
Yes, it is. And it's even used in animal products, because the Latin name of the sea buckthorn, which is Ipophae, means shining horse, because if the horse eats the leaves, it gets nice fur. And it's also nice for digestive upsets in animals. So it is a really broad range of uses. It's a fun crop.
Do you see room for it to grow more based on how much is already produced and used?
Supply and demand is always a little bit, it's never totally in sync, eh? It's always, one is always adjusting to the other, and it's often a little bit awkward. You don't want to go too fast, but I think there could be more. We need to kind of consolidate. We need to be more, growers need to be more secure that they're going to be able to sell large amounts before they go bigger. Or else they become their own processor, I guess. But because it's not a crop is grown hardly at all in the United States. So there's some demand there.
Okay, so I guess it's what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Does the grower grow a bit more, or does the producer or the processor ask for a bit more.
Yeah, well, I think also in the beginning, the growers thought that this plant needed nothing but sunlight and fresh air to grow because it had this bacteria to produce its nitrogen, and everybody thought that it didn't need any water because they all saw it growing on the mountains of Tibet. They had to get over that misconception to get to viable yield.
High bush cranberry was a big surprise for me on your list, and I've grown it as an ornamental. I've never cooked it, but someone was telling me recently when he processed it that it had a most surprising smell. And I wonder if you can tell us about high bush cranberry.
It's the blue cheese of fruit. Tastes like a cranberry and smells like an old boot. Yeah, it's a fun fruit. I mean, it is very, very marginal. I have one customer who has a high bush cranberry orchard, and Cultur'Innov has one.
Okay.
And I don't know, there's probably another one somewhere in Quebec, but it's, very, very marginal. But there will be people going out and picking it in the wild and selling the fruit just the same.
Mm-hmm.
We had the chance because we met with Bob Boers of the University of Saskatchewan, who developed the dwarf cherries and the haskaps, and they had a collection of high bush cranberry selections, we'll call them.
Mm-hmm.
You could call them cultivars, I guess, but anyway, they're nice high bush plants that were noticed to be particularly nice in the wild. So somebody took a cutting and now they have an orchard of them, and the plant has a name. But it's not like there have been crosses and real work on a high bush cranberry. I don't think so. So they shared their cuttings with us, and now we're going to be able to watch them grow too.
Great.
So we have some of the wild ones, and we have some of these cuttings growing, and they're starting to produce. So the high bush cranberry, it's sort of distantly related to elderberry, but not that similar. You get nice flowers in the spring, a smaller cyme of flowers, and then you get these clusters of beautiful red berries. Often you'll read that it's best to let them freeze in the fall, and they taste better after they've had a frost, and the birds certainly don't eat them until they've frozen. I don't know exactly why. So that's what we were doing at first. We were thinking, oh, they're red, but we can't harvest them because we have to wait. And this year we really realized that that was wrong, and that we were waiting too long, and they were kind of going rotten and fermenting. So you don't have to wait that long. You can harvest them. I guess we should have been harvesting them beginning of September, so maybe in Ontario even end of August, as soon as the berries kind of start to get a little bit translucent.
Okay.
And they have a big seed inside them, a big flat seed that maybe takes up about half the volume of the berry. So you're not going to be eating these out of hand like a raspberry for sure. They're sour, and they make your mouth pucker a little bit. I think like a lot of berries that have big seeds, you tend to process them in ways that kind of get rid of the seed, like the traditional things to do with high bush cranberries would be like jellies and coulis. I know in the region of Quebec where I used to live, it was quite popular. I find them nice in kombucha. I find the kombucha process sort of gets rid of the little parts of the taste that are a little more annoying and focuses it more on the nice part, and it gives it a nice sort of tomato red color. I think they've been made into beer too. My client, I think he sold them to the microbrewery. I really see them as you know, someone who would make jellies and coulis, they really go well with wild game. It's because it's kind of one of those strong tastes to go with a strong taste, you know. I think that would be a niche that they could fill really well.
And the fact that it's something that is a native plant and wild game, there's that same
Yeah.
there's that connection there too, as well as the taste.
Yeah. Oh, I wish I had more customers doing that, but we're going to have to prove there's money to be made, and we haven't done that yet.
Coming up, we talk about hardy kiwi, cherries, choke cherries, and agroforestry. And to finish off, Laurie also gives her tips for people considering growing specialty crops. That's all coming up in just a moment. A shout out today to Debbie in Alberta for the pictures of a caterpillar tunnel, which she sent as an idea for Emma's tomato crop. Debbie, thanks very much. We love that idea. And to Tim, thanks for the fun email. Thanks all of you for being part of our food gardening gang. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story, with your hosts Emma Biggs and me, Stephen Biggs. Now, back to our chat with Laurie Brown. Something that's very different from the high bush cranberry is the hardy kiwi. And tell us about that.
Well, hardy kiwis come from southern Russia and Southeast Asia in maritime climates. And they grow in forests, they're vines, and they can grow really, really fast in a year. They can grow like 12 feet in a year. There's two kinds, the one that grows really lots and the one that grows really, really lots. Yeah, I know they're growing them in Ontario. There's a few growers. Coming from a maritime climate, they're used to stable spring weather. You know, if in the Maritimes in the spring it stays cool longer, and then when spring arrives, it's not a fake spring, it's a real spring, and it's okay to grow and go, and off they go. But I've had some growers growing them like in the hills, in the Laurentians, for example, or in the Ottawa foothills, where spring, there's a lot of false springs because we don't have the moderating influence of a large body of water. And then they'll bud. And once they've budded, they're not like an apple tree or a haskap bush. The buds and the new leaves are very, very sensitive to frost. They freeze like a tomato plant, basically. Okay. So then they'll say, oh, okay, I froze once, I'll start up again. But, you know, if they have to start up too many times, it gets to be a bad situation. They lose their vigor, they can lose their flower buds. So really, it's nice to site them near larger bodies of water, or to have some kind of frost protection in place, have them on a hill or something. There's one species, I guess, that's good into, I'd say, about zone 4B, which would be a good part of Ontario, and the other one's less hardy. I'd say more into zone 5. They need a long growing season. And we're just sort of starting to, often we compare them to grapes because they're vines and they're vigorous and they need to be pruned to assist them, and they need to be pruned when they're dormant, and they need to be pruned when they're growing, and you know, they're always doing something. So they have that in common with grapes, but in some ways they're really opposite because they need a lot more fertilizer and they need a lot more water. So some things are the same, some things are different. The fruit themselves taste exactly as good as a kiwi from the grocery store, and I'd say probably They probably taste as good as a grocery store kiwi would taste if you could pick it mature off the vine, not what we're getting in the grocery stores. So they are quite good, and they have no fuzz. So you can eat the skin, and they'll be ready in August or September. And so on paper, more profit in this crop than a lot of other ones, but the challenges of frost in the spring, frost in the fall before they're ripe, cold weather damage in the winter, we haven't yet proven that it's viable. And where is it viable in Quebec? I think the most viable plantations are not where you think they would be in the most southern and warm part of Quebec. They're sort of along the St. Lawrence River Valley, around Quebec City, and even colder areas, just because they have a long growing season where it doesn't freeze and it doesn't get that hot, but the important thing is it can't get too cold, and the weather has to be stable.
Is the spring a little bit later there too because of the St. Lawrence?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, they're a real interesting crop. I'd say right now there's a big buzz around kiwi in Quebec, a lot of interest. So we'll see where it goes. But you would be selling those fresh. You'd end up processing your leftovers and your gravy plant fruit, but really you're aiming for the fresh market.
So that's where the kiwis are different from most of those other crops we've talked about, I guess, except the haskap, because they were more processed.
Yeah, fresh market is always nice if it's a possibility, I think. Saves you from all that processing equipment.
Now, a while back, you were mentioning Bob Boers in Saskatchewan, and that they had those Highbush cranberry selections. And so talking about Saskatchewan, it's got me thinking about cherries, because I know there's been a lot going on there with cherries, and cherries is one of the things that I know you've worked on. What's the state of cherries?
Well, before I get to the part that interests people more, I'll just talk up for a minute about choke cherries that people are never interested in. But Bob Boers also shared with us his selection of choke cherries, and we have them growing in our orchard too.
Okay.
Yeah, but I know people don't want to hear about choke cherries, so
Actually,
we'll move
I'm
right
interested though, so tell me, because I have a couple growing in my backyard. I love them for jelly, and I think they're ornamental for home gardeners too. So what's the
Yeah,
potential for choke cherry, do you think?
well, they're very productive if you can keep all the critters off them, the raccoons and the birds, and there's quite a few insects and mammals and birds that are interested in choke cherries, but if you can keep them away, they're quite productive. But then you've got a small astringent cherry with a big seed. So you might be heading for juice and jellies. That's sort of been the pioneer approach to it, or wines and things. I was reading a bit about indigenous peoples, and sometimes they took the opposite approach and sort of saw the chokecherries as a nut, and they would just get rid of the pulp part and concentrate on the seed and process that.
Interesting.
We'll see. They grow fast. So that's the chokecherry. And Bob Boers, of course, kind of finished off work that had been started by his predecessors with these hybrid cherries that are a cross of 3 different species. And they're what you call a bush sour cherry. Now, we've all bought pies, cherry pies, or a can of cherry pie filling, and the cherries aren't, they're kind of orange or yellowish in the middle. That's the standard pie cherry, but the ones from Saskatchewan are deep red and flavorful through and through. They're really nice processing cherry. They're not sweet enough to win over, the kind of cherries that we get from Southern Ontario or BC. although some people do eat them fresh, but they're mostly processed. And when they came out of Saskatchewan, they said, okay, these cherries are good to whatever zone they said, certainly zone 3. I wonder if they didn't say zone 2, but I'm not sure. We'll say zone 3. And they said, well, we're growing them here in Saskatchewan, and we don't water them, we don't prune them, we don't fertilize them. Everything is good. Okay. So a lot of people in Quebec got really interested. What can sound better than that?
Mm-hmm.
So we started growing them. And I guess climate is more generous in Quebec than it is in the prairies. These dwarf cherries got 11 feet tall. Wow. In Quebec. And they definitely got leaf diseases. And yeah, it was not an easy go. They got this leaf disease called leaf spot. The cherry trees could lose all their leaves by the middle of July, not have a leaf on them. Often the next year they would just be dead. And also it's been, in the beginning, there was a lot of interest in cherries, and there's hardly anybody left growing them. Between the leaf spot and the other thing is, if you don't have that moderating large body of water handily nearby, cherries bloom very early, and the flowers and the developing fruit are very frost tender. So I think people would lose their crop almost 2 years out of 3, depending on where they were.
Wow.
So my last customer that I have now growing these cherries bought those greenhouse tunnels, the small greenhouses. Yes. And he's kind of put little short greenhouses over top his rows, and he can open up the sides. So there's no more rain falling on his cherries, so he's not going to get nearly so much leaf spot. And if there's a frost warning, he can just roll down the sides and put in some propane heat.
Wow.
And that's done in the Scandinavian countries too, I guess, probably more with sweet cherries. But they definitely were not the easy go they were supposed to be. But when everything goes right, they do really give the yields that they were supposed to give. They can be very productive, but it's a long job picking them.
So very heavy on labor to bring in that harvest.
Yeah. And I mean, you really have to watch them. If the leaf spot, we're talking about multiple sprays. And if you go organic, you would be multiple sprays. And
that's interesting. It really points out how a crop that seems ideal in one area could be far from ideal in another area, just because of differences in conditions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's sort of misadapted to our climate in Quebec. Yeah.
I wanted to, before we finish too, just ask about the agroforestry, because I know on a home garden scale, a lot of people talk about the idea of forest gardens now, and having these situations with different plants growing in the same space. And so thinking about agroforestry and different things going on, where is that at in Quebec?
Well, there's a lot of interest, a lot of programs and subsidies for windbreaks and for riparian buffer strips. Mm-hmm. So that's really becoming a common thing that many agricultural consultants do on a regular basis, and a lot more attention to, making them using species that favor biodiversity. So those two really going forward. Alley cropping, where you'll have a row of trees and then another crop between, where it's more than just a windbreak, or you could say many repeated windbreaks, I guess, and another crop between. That is not as widely adopted, but there's active research on the subject. And I think it kind of took them a while to prove that it was really having a beneficial effect, because I mean, there's so many variables to analyze and you have to wait a long time, many years. But the latest research has been much more convincing. Any kind of practice that's going to conserve water is going to become more important. And I think in the case of many fruit, you know, if when it gets too hot, they just kind of shut down. They stop photosynthesizing and they go into survival mode. So maybe in 10 or 20 years we'll be getting higher yields with light shade than we'll be getting with full sun, you know. And I think one of the biggest benefits of agroforestry is when you're doing animals on pasture. They go straight for the shade. And I think you can see the benefits faster than with two plants. When you have a plant and an animal, it's so it's coming. It's coming. There was a lot of interest in forest gardens in Quebec too. It was a big, I don't know, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, it was the big thing. I try to avoid it because it's too complicated on a commercial level, you know.
Yes.
It's you would never end. You take you 5 years to make your orchard plan, and then but try and do things that are more simplified, but still kind of tap into the potential, you know.
Like a simplified forest garden then with 2 or 3 species as opposed to numerous?
Yeah, perhaps. I did a plan for some people this fall, but it was more for, how can I say, landowners who have abandoned fields and kind of want to do something with it. And I thought, well, they don't want to have just 2 or 3 things. They want to have 7 or 8 things, but it has to be simple and replicable and easy to do. So I kind of made a plant that's sort of like a cookie cutter, you know. You could just repeat it. And so I don't know what's going to happen with that, if it's going to go or not, but it was a fun project. Yeah, I think in today's world, there's more chance of surviving as a small grower, because if you're good with your marketing and the social media and all that, makes it easier than it was 15 years ago.
I'm glad you brought us back to that point, because I wanted to wrap up on that note too, and just see what thoughts you have for small producers when it comes to getting those specialty crops out to market. How should they think, or how should they look at things to create opportunity?
I'd say go slowly, start small, and start processing and selling right away and experiment. Farmers markets are a lot of fun the first few times you go, and then it gets quite demanding, you know. You'll never have lineups at your stall of emerging berry products like people are going to have at their stall of vegetables. And sometimes it's not a profitable way to market things.
That's a very interesting comment, because I think a lot of people dream of growing something and going to market, but it might not make sense for some of these niche products.
Many of my clients have tried it, and it's hard for them to pay the rent for their table. Except I'd say where it really gets good is when it's the Christmas markets or the Easter market, where people are thinking, I need to buy a gift.
Okay.
Then it's good. But like, even if you know, the everyday ones, I'd say the Haskaps would be fine. The fresh fruit ones are fine, but the other ones, they'd have to tweak the model, I think, and maybe go together, a few of them together, and not all have to sit there, each one of them at every market. Agrotourism is a bigger thing than we think it is, and some crops are well suited to it, you know. Elderberries, there's so much folklore around them. It definitely, you can't assume you're going to be able to sell them easily. you're going to be explaining what a HASCAP is for another decade, and that is the best known one amongst them.
Yeah. So being a teacher as well as a producer, really.
Yeah. You have to like explaining the benefits, and you have to really believe in your crop. And I think when that happens, it goes a lot better.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. And thank you so much for your insights and bringing us up to date on what's going on with the work you've been doing, Laurie.
Oh, well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
That was our chat with Laurie Brown, an agronomist with Cultur'Innov, and you can find Cultur'Innov online at cultur'innov.qc.ca. That's cultur'innov.qc.ca. What did you think? Growing the crops is one thing, finding a market for them is another. Creativity can go a long way, and one creative idea that stuck with me was the idea of Highbush cranberries going into a specialty beer. I was also interested to learn how difficult it can be to remove sea buckthorn fruit from the branches, and that freezing is the way it's done. I had no idea. The podcast is back next Thursday, but before that, don't forget that next week's show starts off as the live radio show on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on realityradio101.com, and you can tune in live so that you can send us your questions. We'd love it if you hang out with us. We have a great show lined up. Donna Balzer joins us to talk about growing veg, and homesteader Steve Maxwell joins us to talk about his journey from being a city boy to his homestead on Manitoulin Island. Do you have feedback or show ideas? Or just want to connect? Find us at foodgardenlife.com or on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where our handle is foodgardenlife.
And you can find me on my website, emmabiggs.ca, and on Instagram as emmabiggs_grows.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Emma Biggs. Thanks for tuning in.